In 1820, a group of radical revolutionaries plotted to overthrow the British government. Their plan? To assassinate the entire cabinet whilst at a dinner and spark a nationwide uprising. It was bold, it was desperate, and it was doomed. This is the story of the Cato Street Conspiracy, a tale of revolution, betrayal and tragedy in the heart of Georgian London. To understand the Cato Street Conspiracy, we need to step back and look at Britain in the early 19th century. The French Revolution in 1789 had inspired hopes of liberty across Europe, but had also instilled fear in the ruling elites. This mixture of heady political ideals combined with economic hardship created a volatile atmosphere in Britain, both amongst the haves and the have-nots. In the 1790s, Britain had seen over 200 sedition trials as the ruling classes sought to maintain the status quo, which was under threat not just from political and industrial unrest, but also from a major rebellion in Ireland by the United Irishmen, and even naval mutinies at Spithead and the Nore. And whilst revolutionary and then Napoleonic France had eventually been defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, the genie was out of the bottle. People in Britain wanted change. Although victorious, the lives of working people were miserable, and peace had brought with it an economic recession. Adding to that economic decline was the fact that thousands of former veterans were returning to the workplace, only to find there were no jobs for them. It didn't help matters that political power was vested in an aristocratic landowning elite, who used their power to ensure their continuing wealth, even during these difficult economic times. Most people did not qualify for the vote, and even if they did, they lived in new industrial cities, like Manchester, that had no parliamentary representation. In a country with a population of nearly 14 million, only 160,000, or 1%, had the vote. The system was stacked in the landed aristocrats' interests. In 1815, the landowning dominated Parliament introduced the Corn Laws, which kept prices of food artificially high, once more benefiting those at the top of the social ladder, whilst making life at the bottom even harder. In this melting pot of economic hardship and growing demands for wider representation in government, radical groups began to emerge, inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution, and indeed by the American Revolution before that. These radicals wanted democracy, an end to corruption, and better working conditions for the working class. And among these radicals was a man named Arthur Thistlewood. Thistlewood wasn't born into radicalism. In fact, born in Lincolnshire in 1774, he was a former soldier who later became a gentleman farmer. But economic hardships and frustration with the government turned him towards revolutionary ideas. By 1816, he was one of the leaders of the Spa Fields riot, a failed attempt to incite an uprising in London. He, along with 3 other leading radicals, was subsequently put on trial for sedition, but the case collapsed when it transpired that the key witness was a government spy, an agent provocateur. The use of agent provocateurs by the government's Home Secretary, the arch-reactionary Lord Sidmouth, became standard practice. Not merely were they informing the authorities of the radicals' intentions, but often they were inciting the radicals to violent actions, and thus allowing the government to stamp down on them with the full weight of the law. For instance, the following year, 1817, another government agent was instrumental in a further and somewhat botched rising at Pentridge in Derbyshire. This time, the leaders were found guilty and were executed for treason. In 1819, radicals across Britain, including Thistlewood, were shocked and outraged when local yeomanry, or cavalry, charged into a protest at St Peter's Field outside Manchester, killing 18 and injuring over 700 people. Known as the Peterloo Massacre, it galvanised Thistlewood. It proved in his mind that peaceful attempts at reform would get nowhere. The only realistic solution was a revolution that would sweep away the governing classes, just as the French had done when they stormed the Bastille. And his mind was further made up when the government, rather than showing any remorse for Peterloo, rushed through Parliament the 6 Acts to further stamp down on opposition. The Acts strengthened laws against seditious libel, increased punitive taxes on radical newspapers, and banned public meetings of 50 people or more. At his subsequent trial, Thistlewood justified his next infamous actions as a response to those events in Manchester, stating that high treason had been committed against the people of Manchester, but that justice had been closed to the victims and their families, and he argued that insurrection had now become a public duty. And this brings us to the Cato Street Conspiracy, so named after Cato Street, just off the Edgware Road in London, where the radicals had their safe house. This revolutionary centre was a dilapidated two-storey stable block. On the ground floor there was a double door for a carriage and also a side door, and inside a narrow staircase led to the hayloft above, and it was here that Thistlewood gathered his arms for the forthcoming revolution. Before I go on, I just want to give a shout out to today's sponsor, Restless. Now, are you scratching your head thinking of a Christmas present for someone who loves learning? Well, how about the gift of 1 year's membership of Restless, which is a digital learning community for the over 50s. Now, I've actually been delivering history talks to them for several years, but apart from history, they've got programs on art, travel, science, fitness and health, cooking, and even learning languages, just to name but a few. Now, that might appeal to someone you know who loves learning from the comfort of their own home, so check them out. And the best bit is, because I've been working with them for a couple of years now, they're actually offering viewers of the History Chap here on YouTube a 20% saving on the usual 12 monthly programme. Now, of course, you could simply buy a Christmas present for yourself as well. It's your choice. Click on the link appearing now or in the description below. And now, let's get back to the Cato Street Conspiracy in 1820. Arthur Thistlewood's plan for Britain's own version of the French Revolution was as audacious as it was deadly. On the morning of the 22nd of February, one of his fellow conspirators showed Thistlewood an advert in a newspaper, the New Times. It stated that on the following evening, a government minister, Lord Harrowby, was to hold a dinner party at his house in Grosvenor Square, about a mile from Cato Street. And on the invite list was the Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, and the entire British Cabinet, including the Foreign Secretary, Lord Castlereagh, the despised Home Secretary, Lord Sidmouth, the long-serving Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nicholas Van Sittard, and the Victor of Waterloo, the Duke of Wellington, in his capacity as Master General of the Ordnance. Thistlewood couldn't believe his good fortune. He would lead his men the 1 mile to the dinner party, storm it, murder the whole cabinet in, quite literally, one sitting, and spark a nationwide revolution. His plan was to place his men in the shadows around Grosvenor Square, which incidentally was the location of the US Embassy in London from 1938 to 2017, and watch the ministers arrive. Once all the cabinet ministers were at Harrowby's residence, the conspirators would make their way across the square, and Thistlewood would knock on the door, claiming he had an important message from the king. He would then barge past the surprised servant, followed by his men, and enter the dining room. And there, with the aid of homemade grenades, pistols, muskets and cutlasses, they would massacre the entire British cabinet. One of their number, a butcher by the name of James Ings, would then cut off the heads of 2 cabinet members who the radicals detested the most, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Castlereagh, and the Home Secretary, Lord Sidmouth, mount them on pikes, and display them on Westminster Bridge. Having assassinated the entire cabinet, other conspirators would set fires in London to create diversions, and then hijack cannon from the Finsbury artillery barracks in the city. They would then secure the barracks of the Light Horse Volunteers on Upper Gray's Inn Lane. Having armed themselves from both of these barracks, they would now proceed to attack the Bank of England, free prisoners from the Newgate prison, à la Bastille, and storm the Tower of London. Thistlewood would then establish a Committee of Public Safety, which would be headquartered at the Mansion House, the seat of the Lord Mayor of London. The radicals believed that their actions in London would precipitate similar risings in the North and Midlands of England and Scotland. 1820 would be the year Britain became a republic. The Cato Street conspirators numbered just over 24 men. Apart from Thistlewood, there was another man from Lincolnshire in his mid-40s, Richard Tidd. We've already met the butcher, James Ings, who originally hailed from Hampshire before coming to London, where he found that the streets were not paved with gold, and he slowly moved his butchery shop down Market from the West End to the East End. Another tradesman who seemed to be going in the wrong direction was former prize-winning bootmaker John Brunt. But possibly the most interesting conspirator, apart from Thistlewood himself, was Jamaican-born William Davidson. The child of the white British Attorney General on the island and a black slave, he had been sent by his father to study in Britain when he was 14. It seemed his father wanted him to enter the law, and indeed he did become an articled clerk to a Liverpool lawyer. He soon tired of the drudgery of being an articled clerk, as indeed would a young Benjamin Disraeli a few years later, and after at least one stint on a ship, possibly pressed into Royal Navy service, he became a cabinet maker. In the economic downturn of 1816, he lost his trade, and soon afterwards this man of colour, as he was referred to at the time, started to dabble in radical politics. What bound these radicals together, apart from their politics, is they were not from the very destitute of society. Most, for instance, could read and write, but many of them, by the late 1810s, seemed to be on a downward economic trajectory. Throughout the 23rd of February 1820, the conspirators started to gather at the stable in Cato Street, where Davidson told curious neighbours they were tradesmen refurbing the building. Up in the hayloft, however, where sacks had been placed over the windows, the men were arming themselves with an assortment of swords, pistols, and even homemade grenades. However, there was one problem. Their ranks had been infiltrated by a government spy named George Edwards. Edwards had been working for the Home Office, feeding them details of the plot. In fact, rather like the Pentridge Rebellion, some historians argue that Edwards had been used to actually encourage the extreme nature of the conspiracy, to justify a crackdown on radicals by Home Secretary Lord Sidmouth. It was Edwards who had arrived with a copy of the New Times, carrying that advert about the dinner at Lord Harrowby's. If Thistlewood had bothered to check, he would have found that there was no reference to this momentous social event in any other of the dozen papers printed that day in London. Sometimes when you're fixated on a goal, you can filter out all the information that just doesn't fit with the narrative you want. The radical leader was hell-bent on striking a decisive blow against the government, and here, according to the newspaper that Edwards had kindly provided, was his opportunity. Even when William Davidson, who had previously worked at Lord Harrowby's house as a cabinet maker, reported that Lord Harrowby's servants knew nothing about this important dinner that was taking place that evening, Thistlewood was unperturbed. But he should have been, because there was no meal taking place at Lord Harrowby's that evening. Thistlewood and the other conspirators had been duped, and the government noose was tightening around the radicals' necks. The authorities were so well informed of the plot that they mobilised the Bow Street Runners, a precursor to the modern Metropolitan Police, and ordered a detachment of soldiers from the Coldstream Guards to march on Cato Street and catch the conspirators red-handed. The 12 officers from the Bow Street Runners quietly slipped into the Horse and Groom pub just across the street from the stable, under the command of a local magistrate. As the minutes ticked by, there was no sign of the promised soldiers. Unbeknown to the men in the pub, the detachment from the Coldstream Guards, in a classic case of miscommunication, had been sent to the wrong location, and were now lined up in a neighbouring street, wondering where on earth the Bow Street Runners were. Ignorant as to the whereabouts of the soldiers, the magistrate decided to take action before the conspirators left on their mission. It was 7:30 p.m, and in the hayloft above the stables, Thistlewood and about 20 armed accomplices were preparing to leave for Grosvenor Square. Downstairs, Ing, armed with his butcher's knife, and Davidson, carrying a sword and a blunderbuss, were on sentry duty. Suddenly the doors burst open, and before either man could react, they were seized by the officers, who now raced up the narrow staircase. As he burst into the hayloft, the leading officer, Richard Smithers, found himself face to face with Thistlewood. The radical leader promptly ran him through the ribs with a sword. Shouting to his men to snuff out the lights, the stables descended into black and confusion, as conspirators and Bow Street Runners tumbled down the stairs. In the melee, one Bow Street Runner, by the name of William Westcott, received 3 bullet holes through the top of his hat, but apart from some bruising as he fell down the stairs, was uninjured. It was at this moment that the Coldstream Guards finally arrived, under the command of Captain Fitzclarence, the illegitimate son of King George IV's younger brother and eventual successor, the Duke of Clarence, later William IV. Sergeant Legg of the Coldstream Guards was shot in the arm as he dived in front of a shot aimed at Captain Fitzclarence. Thistlewood, Robert Adams, John Brunt and John Harrison all managed to escape, but their freedom was short-lived. Within a day they'd been apprehended, and Thistlewood, along with 10 fellow conspirators, charged with 4 counts of high treason. During their trial at the Old Bailey, the defence once more tried the same ploy that had worked so successfully following the Spa Fields riots, namely that the government spy, Edwards in this case, was unreliable. As it was, the government agent was not called upon because 2 of the other conspirators, Robert Adams and a man called John Monument, turned King's evidence. And that evidence against Thistlewood and the conspirators was damning. On the 28th of April 1820, the 11 conspirators were found guilty and sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered, the ancient punishment for high treason. In the end, only 5 men were executed, with the other 6 transported to Australia. Records are unclear as to whether any of them ever returned home. The ghastly executions were then themselves merely commuted to merely hanging and then beheading once the men were dead. Arthur Thistlewood, Richard Tidd, James Ings, William Davidson and John Brunt were executed outside Newgate Prison, London, on the morning of the 1st of May, 1820. Thousands turned up to watch the spectacle, many indeed arriving the previous afternoon and camping out overnight. It was such a spectacle that the more well-to-do citizens of London paid up to 2 guineas, which is closing in on £100 nowadays, to watch the execution from the upper floors of adjoining buildings. This massive attendance in itself made the authorities twitchy, and 2 troops of lifeguards, along with infantry and artillery, were deployed just in case. Ironically, the artillery was provided by the Finsbury Barracks, the very barracks that Thistlewood had planned to take over in his revolution. At 7 a.m, the hangman appeared on the scaffold. The convicted men were then led out of Newgate Prison, Thistlewood sucking an orange. Whilst Davidson prayed with the chaplain, Ing broke out into the radical song, "Give me death or liberty." His address to the crowds was an incoherent ramble, unlike Brunt, who stated boldly, "It is better to die free than live slaves." Tidd, even more than Thistlewood, seems to have become the crowd's favourite, and they gave him 3 cheers as he mounted the scaffold. Both Lincolnshire men refused to wear a hood to cover their face. Having been left to hang for half an hour to ensure that they were dead, the hangman had actually pulled down on the legs of Brunt and Ing as they had taken a bit longer to strangle to death. The bodies were then lowered down, and the macabre ritual of decapitation now took place. Rather than the hangman, this task was carried out by another masked man, who used a sharp knife, rather like a surgeon's knife, to cut the heads from the bodies and then hold them up to the crowd. Each beheading was accompanied by boos and hisses from the crowd. Indeed, some even started to throw rotten fruit and vegetables at the masked man up on the scaffold. It was the last time that executions for treason were conducted in this way in England. Arthur Thistlewood's dream of a British Revolution had ended in failure. The Cato Street Conspiracy has also largely been forgotten. Britain's changed a lot since 1820. The idea of a violent revolution overthrowing a government seems alien to most people. And yet, back then, in an age of hardship, inequality and repression, it seemed to some people a viable option. The stable block used by Arthur Thistlewood and his conspirators, No. 1 Cato Street, is the only surviving building in the road from this period of turmoil. The Grade 2 listed building, which is now a private dwelling, is easily identified by a blue plaque that was placed on the wall in 1977. And nothing more epitomises how Britain has changed than the site where the pub stood opposite the stables and where the Bow Street runners assembled. The pub has long gone, and in its place now stands a complex of modern 1-bedroom flats, which go for over £500,000 each. I wonder what those conspirators would have made of that.
So, what do you think about the Cato Street Conspiracy? I mean, were Thistlewood and his followers misguided revolutionaries? Were they gangsters? Or just desperate people with no other options? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Oh, and don't forget to check out that Christmas deal from Restless with the 20% discount that I mentioned earlier. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.